Hey guys, and welcome to a new series which I'm going to be making, which is called TF2 What If? And I'm basically just going to be taking stories from the TF2 comics and changing them up. You know, what if something else happened and it went completely different? So please let me know what you think of this and like what scenarios you'd like to see next. And yeah, let's just get right into this. What if Radigan Conagher only built a life-extending machine for Blutarch Mann? Our story begins in the year 1890. Radigan Conagher was sitting in a cramped office opposite a frail, elderly man. It was the head of Builders League United, Blutarch Mann. He was barely clinging to life. He was surrounded by tubes sticking in his veins that were connected to a drip bag keeping him alive. The gravel wars had dragged out for 40 years, and it had taken its toll on the old man. He told Radigan how he had been trying to take his brother Redmond's land with hired mercenaries, but it had become a stalemate. Blutarch had tasked Radigan to construct a life-extending machine to keep him alive so he could outlive his brother and take his land for his own. "Make me a monster," Blutarch growled. Radigan simply replied, "All right." Radigan left Blutarch's office and rode home quickly through the night to start preparations for the life-extending machine. Upon arriving home, he found his workshop to be empty, just as he had left it. Radigan breathed a sigh of relief at this. He had half expected some bounty hunter or shadow government agent to threaten him over taking a job as controversial as cheating God himself. Pushing all of that to the back of his mind, he cleared his desk with a single sweep, grabbed a fistful of fresh blueprints and a pencil, and began to brainstorm. Many sleepless nights came and went, but try as he might, Radigan could not quite manage it. He devised hundreds of wildly different concepts for the life-extending machine, but none of them had the desired effect. And as the weeks passed by, he finally came to the realization that he could not do it alone. He was the best engineer in Texas, maybe even the world, but he dealt mostly with practical problems. He needed someone with a more mystical approach. Marasmus the Wizard was sitting alone in his fortune-telling booth, anxiously counting loose change. He owed the Italian mob a lot of money, and unless the price of his freedom was under 50 cents, he needed that money fast. He had borrowed money from them to start his own business telling fortunes for a living. However, business was poor, and he didn't have enough to pay them back. The wizard was suddenly startled as there was a knock on the side of his booth, accompanied by a deep voice saying, "Hey, we need to talk." "Oh no, here they are to kill me," thought Marasmus. "No, it wasn't me. It was the other wizard a couple of blocks away. The great Marasmus never lies. Please don't kill me," Marasmus shrieked, backing away from the door. "What in tarnation are you talking about, Pops?" replied a confused Radigan Conagher. "I'm looking for information. It involves this voodoo crap. Yeah, I ain't no guru or whatever. Think you can help me out? I've got gold." Marasmus's eyes sparkled. "Gold? You did say gold, didn't you? Well, come in, my fine fellow. Come on, make yourself at home. Marasmus the Wizard is an excellent host." Radigan took a seat opposite Marasmus and hauled a small purse of gold onto the table in front of him, which caused the wizard to grin and lean forward in his seat. Radigan began to explain everything to Marasmus, how he had been tasked with creating a machine to extend a person's life, but he didn't know where to start. He asked Marasmus to help. Marasmus eagerly agreed to help. Granting someone the gift of immortality wasn't going to be easy, but he needed that money. "Marasmus the Wizard will help. For a price," the wizard trilled with a devilish grin on his face. Marasmus could only think of one way to sustain life for a mere mortal like Blutarch. A precious metal he had heard of through myths and legends, told to him by ancient spirits, called Australium. Marasmus explained to Radigan that this element had the capability to enhance the body, mind, and even extend one's life. It had allowed Australians to become the most technologically advanced society on the planet, creating abilities such as teleportation and cloaking. Radigan nodded. He had heard about the advancements made by Australians, so this mystery element was how they did it. The element can only be found in the Australian desert. A pity its immense potential is squandered on such fools, Erasmus retorted harshly. Radigan considered what the wizard had told him. If what the wizard said was true, then he could use the Australium to power the life-extending machine. This was what he was looking for. It had to be. Radigan left quickly after paying the wizard, much to his delight. He would be safe from the Mafia. For now. As soon as he arrived home, Radigan posted a letter addressed to Builders League United, telling them all about Australium and where to find it, and that it was vital he be given as much as possible to construct the life-extending machine. It was their only chance at making this work. Reinvigorated by the discovery of this new element, Radigan worked day and night drawing up schematics and honing the final design for the contraption. No more than a week later, the very first shipment of Australium was delivered to Radigan's workshop. Blutarch was willing to do anything to outlive his brother, and he was running out of time. He could only hope that Radigan knew what he was doing, but only time would tell. Radigan held a bar of Australium in his hand. He couldn't take his eyes off it. It seemed to almost glow with power, a power he could feel coursing through his veins. That crazy wizard was telling the truth after all. He closed his fist around the Australium. Time to work. As days of extensive manual labor passed, Radigan noticed a change in himself. He could work all through the night before, but he always felt fatigued in the morning. Now, if anything, he felt better, stronger, more determined. Welding and hammering felt easier than ever, and his mind felt so clear that he drew up dozens of blueprints without even thinking about it. Erasmus had told him that Australium had strong transformative effects following extended exposure, but it was only now that he realized its true potential. It could turn a competent user into a god amongst men. No one saw him for 2 weeks after that day. People speculated he had gone insane, as they could hear the sounds of something huge and mechanical brooding in his workshop late into the night. They were scared to go anywhere near there. What was he building in there? When he finally did emerge, they hardly recognized him. He looked at least 10 years younger. His muscles bulged under his shirt, and he looked 3 inches taller than before. Rumors began to circulate that he had conspired with a wizard to perform witchcraft and retain his youth. When someone finally mustered up the courage to ask him what he had been up to, he replied cryptically, "I have cheated God," before shrugging his muscular shoulders and heading back inside. Miles away, Blutarch Mann sat slumped behind his desk. He rubbed his palms together, a grisly smirk on his face. He had already heard the good news. "You may not know it yet, brother," he gloated to himself, "but I have already won." The next few decades were defined by the overwhelming success of Builders League United. Following the expiration of Radigan Mann, his brother Blutarch inherited all of his properties, effectively doubling the strength and clout of the company and bringing an abrupt end to the gravel wars. Builders League didn't stop there though. They exploited their near monopoly on natural resources in the United States, like coal, timber, gold, and gravel, to quickly rise to the top of the corporate ladder, outcompeting almost every other company present at the time. Manco, which had profited off manufacturing and selling munitions to both sides during the gravel wars, suffered because they just lost their 2 biggest partners, and they were eventually bought out by Blue, only adding to their growing empire. Shortly after this acquisition, the lesser-known shadow corporation, TF Industries, also mysteriously disbanded. Opinions differed at the time as people debated what solicited this reaction, but it was clear that whoever ran the company made a critical error in allowing the gravel wars to end, as they held large shares in Manco. In any case, The lack of competition caused Builders League United to become the single most powerful force in the world, expanding to every corner of the globe and holding a great deal of influence on world affairs. And throughout all of this, Blutarch Mann lived on. He never appeared in the public anymore, but he sat in the shadows, ruling over the largest empire in modern history. Many years later, a young Dell Conagher sat alone in the waiting room of Builders League United. A Conagher had always held the position of chief engineer of the company ever since 1890. His grandfather had been personally offered the position after constructing Mr. Mann's life extending machine, and after he retired, his son, Dell's father, took up the position, and now Dell's father Fred had retired, and it was his turn. He looked up to see Blutarch's secretary, an elderly woman, approaching him with a sweet smile on her face. She greeted him as Mr. Conagher, although he insisted she call him simply Dell. Mr. Conagher was his grandfather's name. The secretary chuckled to herself as she remembered meeting Radigan all those years ago as a younger woman. She ushered Dell through a large door into a spacious and ornate office that was fit for a king. Every surface was decorated with expensive paintings or golden sculptures, and sat in the middle of it all was an enormous hulking machine that was hooked up to what looked like a corpse slumped on a throne. It was Blutarch. Dell turned to the secretary with a look of shock and concern. He asked if he should run for help. This clearly amused the secretary, and she explained that Blutarch sometimes experienced malfunctions with his life extending machine, which caused him to be technically dead for short periods of time. And that was coincidentally exactly why he had brought Dell here, in the hopes that he could fix his grandfather's machine. Dell had so many questions, but he just nodded his head. He would have to get used to seeing things that he couldn't explain. Suddenly, there was a flash of electricity, and sparks flew as Blutarch shot back in his seat with a howl of agony and frustration. Dell got his first good look at his employer, and his appearance made him shudder. His hair was completely gone. His skin was as white as a sheet and stretched thin over his bony features, and his cracked lips were contorted into an awful grimace. Blutarch didn't make appearances in the public, and no one at the company knew what he looked like except for the higher-ups. Now Dell understood why that was. Blutarch glared back at the engineer, blue fire burning in his eyes. "Chief engineer, are you? Well, don't just stand there. Do your bloody job! Fix this confounded machine!" Dell was taken aback by the vile demeanor of his boss. This was the man running the company which he loved, whom his family had worked for generations. He pushed it all to the back of his mind for now and stepped up to examine the life extending machine that his grandfather had built all those years ago. He had spent a lot of time with his grandfather growing up. However, he was a quiet man and highly secretive, almost never telling him about his past. That wasn't to say that he was a cold man. He cared deeply for young Dell, and often sat with him for hours helping him with his maths homework and constantly getting frustrated that the school was teaching him the wrong way. He was a great engineer and a man who Dell looked up to as a boy. However, he never really learned anything about his work as an engineer. He had taken all of his secrets with him to the grave. Dell realized this now as he examined the life extending machine. It was completely alien to him. He wouldn't even know where to start. Dell turned to Blutarch and shook his head. "Look, I'm sorry, but I have no idea how to fix this thing." He gestured to the machine. "If I touched this thing, I'd probably just kill you again." Blutarch slammed his bony fist on the desk and cursed. "Confound your lummox of a grandfather! Why did I ever hire that second-rate fool?" Dell felt the urge to lash out at hearing Blutarch discredit his late grandfather, but he maintained his composure. Blutarch lashed out at Dell now. "He was the first in a long line of oafs, and it seems you're continuing the family tradition." He sighed and pulled a stack of yellowed papers from a drawer under his desk before dropping them in a heap in front of himself. Dell ignored the jab at him and asked what the papers were. Blutarch looked at Dell with a sly smirk across his cracked lips. "These are your grandfather's blueprints." Dell's jaw dropped in disbelief. But the old man had him. Buried with him, yes. I dug up your grandfather and looted his corpse. If it makes you feel better, those scribblings have been the bane of my existence for the last 50 years, and every word is utter gibberish. It did not make Dell feel any better. His hands clenched into fists. He could forgive Blutarch's rude and entitled attitude, but this was the ultimate disrespect to his late grandfather, a man who he had looked up to greatly. It took everything in him to keep a lid on his emotions, and even then, it was plain to see how he really felt on his face, which was a stern scowl. Blutarch saw this and chuckled. He seemed to derive a sick form of pleasure from repeatedly antagonizing Dell. You may borrow them. He pushed the stack of blueprints carelessly towards Dell, who quickly scooped them up and into his arms. Decipher them and fix my machine, he continued. Dell nodded his head and quickly turned to leave, keen for any excuse to get out of that office. Blutarch grabbed his shoulder. One more thing, he said. Dell slowly turned to face him. If you find anything else of interest, remember, it's mine. Bring it directly to me. Do not build it. Dell looked at Blutarch for a moment, and then at the stack of blueprints in his arms, and then back at Blutarch. All right, he replied. Dell sat alone in his workshop, looking at his grandfather's blueprints, and thinking about the way Blutarch had treated him, and how he had disrespected his dead grandfather. He was incredibly conflicted. He loved Blue. His family had been working there for over 50 years, and they took great pride in their jobs as chief engineers. And this was how Blutarch repaid their years of service? It made Dell sick to his stomach. How on earth was a frail old man who was a corpse periodically a suitable fit to lead a company as important as Blue anyway? The CEO was supposed to be someone young, charismatic, and smart. Dell sighed to himself as he began to examine the blueprints his grandfather had taken with him to the grave. Now that he had time to look closer at the blueprints, they began to make more sense to him. The longer he looked at them, the more sense they made. Hours felt like minutes as he learned more and more. Things that he hadn't even thought possible. Things that he hadn't even considered before. He studied all through the night, and as the light of the early morning shone through the room, he realized that he knew how to build all of these machines inside out. Not just a life-extending machine, but all kinds of other contraptions which his grandfather had devised. After Dell learnt about all of these amazing creations, he felt a newfound sense of admiration for his grandfather. He knew he had been a great engineer, but he had no idea how great the advances he had made actually were. This technology was far ahead of anything he had ever seen, even so many years later. It was all because of his grandfather that Blutarch was even still alive now. He was the one who had cheated death. Blutarch owed his life to Radigan, and yet he treated him with such disrespect as to defile his corpse and insult his memory to his grandson's face? Dell spat, thinking about what Blutarch had said to him earlier. He didn't deserve to live, and Builders League didn't rightfully belong to him. It only existed because of the work of his grandfather. His thoughts were interrupted by a beep on his walkie-talkie. Blutarch wanted to see him. He'd hardly realized that it was even the next day. Dell looked back at the plans for the life-extending machine. He had made up his mind what he would do. He was going to make Blutarch pay for how he had treated them. Far away in his office, Blutarch was considering whether or not he should sign a lease to mine more gravel pits. He checked his watch. Where was that useless engineer? It had been almost 15 minutes since he called for him. Was he late on purpose? He was a busy man. He had places to be. A short while later, the engineer did arrive and entered the office without a word. Blutarch scowled at him, trying to meet his gaze as he wandered over to the control panel of the life-extending machine and began to tinker with it. Blutarch finally spoke up. "You're late," he spat in a venomous tone. "And you're long overdue. retorted the engineer, yanking several wires out of the machine at once, creating a loud buzz and sending blue sparks flying across the room. Blutarch bolted up in his seat, eyes bulging out of his head, chest heaving, unable to breathe. He stared at Dell, pure fear spread across his face. He tried to plead for help, but choked on his own blood. Dell just glowered at him, his goggles and hard hat obscuring almost all of his face. Blutarch's skin turned white, and then grey as he seemed to rapidly age. Time finally caught up to him, and with a final muffled groan, he keeled over onto his desk, dead. Blutarch's secretary shuffled jovially through the door, carrying a tray of coffee and cakes. It took her a moment to process what had happened, but when she did, her eyes widened and her jaw dropped. The tray crashed to the floor, and the secretary tried to run, but Dell was faster. He reached under Blutarch's desk and slammed the panic button. All the doors slammed in unison, blocking her only exit, and in other parts of the building, alarms blared as a commotion ensued with people shouting and moving through hallways. Dell pointed a pistol at the secretary and instructed her directly. "You're gonna come with me and explain how Mr. Mann here encountered a slight mishap with his life extending machine, and we were just too late to save him. You're then gonna testify that you witnessed his dying words, which were that I, Radigan Conagher, were to assume the position of CEO of Builders League United following his death. Do you understand?" The secretary stared at Dell for a moment in shock, and then hurriedly nodded her head. "Good." Dell activated the intercom system and spoke into the microphone. "If I could have your attention for a moment, please. Something truly terrible has happened. Mr. Mann has unfortunately passed away. If you could please make your way to the front of the building, everything will be explained in further detail." Dell pushed the microphone away and looked back at the secretary, who was still standing in the same spot, a look of fear across her face. "Best not to keep him waiting," he said calmly, deactivating the panic alarm and wandering through the now open doorway and down the hall. The secretary took one last look at Blutarch Mann's mangled corpse and reluctantly followed him. It had now been 6 months since the death of Blutarch Mann. Immediately after the initial shock, the 2 Police Department launched an investigation into the case, questioning the 2 witnesses, which were also the only suspects if foul play was involved. Both witnesses testified the same story. Mr. Mann had experienced a malfunction with an experimental machine which was keeping him alive. The 2 witnesses found him, but were unable to save him, and he died shortly thereafter. Nobody at the police department understood how the life-extending machine even worked. In fact, the only person who did was a potential suspect, Radigan Conagher. With a lack of sufficient evidence and understanding, the police ruled that Blutarch's death was an accident caused by mechanical failure and closed the case. As for what became of Builders League, Radigan Conagher was appointed as the new CEO of the company. He stated publicly that Blutarch's last act as the former CEO was to make him his successor, and this claim was also supported by Blutarch's own secretary, who was also present. Under Dell's watchful eye, Builders League United experienced a record quarter, and he was immensely popular with his employees too. He was young, energetic, charismatic, and charming. Everyone agreed that he was a much better boss than Blutarch ever was. Now, Dell sat back on his throne in an all-new office he had designed himself. It was situated right at the top of the new and improved Blue headquarters. The wall opposite him was made of glass, and from here he could see men working like tiny ants below him. They were building a statue of his grandfather, Radigan Conagher, to celebrate the great contribution he had made to the company. He turned to look behind him. The life-extending machine was sitting in the corner of his office. He had it moved personally up to his office. He didn't need it yet, although he had to admit that the promise of immortality did sound tempting. He had secretly been working on a revision of the design, which would be more efficient and lightweight. But there was something missing. A telephone on his desk began to ring. He answered it, and began to speak to the person on the other end. Mr. Hale, how's the Australia mission coming along? Did you find it? How much? Excellent. Send it over right away. Bye-bye now. Dell put the receiver down. A satisfied grin spread across his face. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. He looked out of the window at his growing empire that expanded to the end of the horizon, and began to laugh to himself. All of this was only the beginning.